There's a quote from Tim Keller, actually, that influenced me, which is, he said, "Wisdom is the ability to see distinctions where others see a blur."
Welcome to a special episode of the Truth Changes Everything podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jeff Myers. And as you know, this show is basically me just calling up people who I think know something really interesting that I want to learn from. My main philosophy in life is you need old people. Well, guess what? My old person on this podcast is somebody who is much younger than me. In fact, a student of mine, Kasey Leander. Kasey is now the director of summer programs at Summit Ministries here in Colorado. And he's also been a writer for the Colson Center, and a speaker on college campuses. I don't know very many people, Kasey, who are as tapped into what people are really thinking about right now, the young adults in this country. So I'm really grateful that you would come on the show, because we got something super important to talk about all of the conflict on the right, Nick Fuentes, antisemitism.
Yeah.
We're going to weigh in on all the tough stuff today.
That's kind, Dr. Jeff. And yeah, when you spend as much time with, I guess, students playing ping pong and hanging out with them, you pick up so I guess some of the attitudes. But I'm here to ask the same questions, and I agree. It's an important time to pay attention to what's going on with the next generation. So thrilled to be here, even though I'm not an old person.
Well, you've got a lot of wisdom that I think everybody who's watching or listening right now, whether they're parents of Summit graduates, just people who love biblical worldview things, fans of the show, students who've come through the program in the past, people who've read the Should Christians Support Israel book, there are going to be a lot of people out there. And look, everybody's piling on this topic right now, and that's not what we want to do. We want to provide more light than heat and see if there's a way to understand all of these current conflicts from a biblical worldview, rather than, putting a stake in the ground on a certain theological position or something like that, it can be helpful to some people, but doesn't really contribute overall. So, man, we got 40 minutes. We're going to solve this thing.
Perfect. So I can't wait. Can't wait to hear what we say.
That's right. All right. Well, let's dig right in. How did we get to this place? There's so much turmoil among conservatives right now. It seems like in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination, you would think that conservatives might come together, but instead they're tearing themselves apart. And this is affecting Christians as well, because it involves the theology of whether we should support Israel or not, and if so, for what reasons, if not, for what reasons, and all of these kinds of things. How did we get to this place?
Yeah, man, it's such a good question. And I've been asking myself that question, as have a lot of culture watchers recently. I guess I thought after Charlie Kirk died, I didn't know what was going to happen. In my mind, it was like either revival or the left is going to go crazy. I don't think I expected the right to start tearing itself apart, but you're exactly right. That's sort of what started to happen from a political standpoint. And as Christians, we try to have both feet anchored in God's word, and let that be our sure footing through uncertain political waters, because the political waters are always changing. God's word is eternal, and it gives us certain principles that we can take into politics. But it is important for us to first and foremost just understand what's going on. There's a quote from Tim Keller, actually, that influenced me, which is, he said, "Wisdom is the ability to see distinctions where others see a blur." And so if we can train our Christians, our churches, our congregations, our students to see, at least start by just being clear on what's happening. To me, I think that's a huge piece of this. So, I think one of the things that really kicked all this off was an interview recently in this latest news cycle, an interview between Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson. So Tucker Carlson had been a major Fox News contributor. He's, I would imagine, a household name. If you're conservative at all, people know who he is. Nick Fuentes, on the other hand, is someone people don't know. He has been sort of lingering on the edges of the conservative movement since the mid-2010s. He was a student at Boston University, right as the world sort of descended into the latest political era. So 2016, he was a student there at BU and experienced a lot of, as you can imagine, in a really secular city. He was the one guy with the MAGA hat on. And so that story of Nick, I mean, you could follow this influencer's journey, but he's a bit of a provocateur. And the main story right now is, how could Tucker Carlson have interviewed a guy who, I don't want to mince words here, Jeff. I mean, he uses the N-word on his show frequently. He would describe himself as a white nationalist.
He's extraordinarily vulgar. If you
Right.
decide you're going to go check out some of his shows after we do this, I just need to warn you. It's vile. Like, he refers to people who got killed in the Holocaust as baking cookies.
Right.
They were baking the cookies. It's unbelievable.
Right. You name it, he's spouted it. It's almost like he's been looking for different cultural taboos across. And I guess to me, Dr. Jeff, the question isn't why is Nick Fuentes saying the things he's saying. There are Nick Fuenteses all over the place. The question is, why is he coming a little more into the mainstream of conservative thought right now, especially among the rising generation? That's the question that's interesting to me.
I think that's a fascinating question. Now, we both looked at this article by Rod Dreher. He lives in Hungary now, in Budapest, but he came to Washington, D.C. for a few days, and he said 40% of the young conservatives he met are fans of Nick Fuentes.
Right. It's shocking to read his thoughts. And, Rod Dreher's quick to say, his Substack is called Rod Dreher's Diary. So he said, I can't substantiate any of this right now. Like, this isn't a news article. This is just my impression of Washington. So he spent a week out there. He's also very close to Vice President J.D. Vance, and so that was part of his meeting. But you're right. Yeah, the thing that caught both of our attention with that article was, he said 30 to 40% of young Gen Z staffers on Capitol Hill or in politics in D.C. right now are following Nick Fuentes eagerly and trying to soak up some of what he's saying. So, yeah, the question is why? What is grabbing the next generation? And I would look. Yeah.
I know. I want to hear it. Because when you encounter an issue like this, and you're trying to ask yourself, how do we even begin to process this from a biblical worldview? Where do you go? What's your process?
Well, man, first of all, there's the old adage about how do you spot counterfeit currencies. You don't actually go track down every piece of counterfeit currency that there's out there. You spend a lot of time looking at real currency, right? What does a real dollar bill look like? And so, it should go without saying that a Christian worldview can only come from studying Scripture and studying the great theologians of Christianity's history, and like knowing who we are as redeemed people, even in a fallen world. So that's step one. But I always want to try to do what the Bereans did, which is the Scripture says they understood the times, right? And that's a big thing for us at Summit. So to me, Dr. Jeff, I look at political history for the last years, and some of this is coming from Nick Fuentes himself, as he talks about his experience as a student in the late 2010s. And the first thing I would say, if we're going to look at the story of political thought recently, is that liberalism has morphed into progressivism. That would be stage one of everything that's happened. So you think about classical liberalism, classical conservatism. Those are two very rich, grounded philosophies. There's a lot that they share in common: support for individual liberty, free speech, right? Both yesterday's liberals and yesterday's conservatives would really have a lot of common ground on that. However, liberalism took a turn, and we could trace this back to the intellectual climate of the 1960s, when a ton of academic institutions sort of got taken over by more progressive ideology. Some of that in response to the civil rights movement, where a lot of progress was made. Others in response to, as we know, a lot of Marxist influence, just out and out Marxist influence on academia. But for whatever reason, liberalism has slowly morphed into a blend of progressivism. And progressivism you could define as just support for the next phase of change. Liberalism might try to ground itself in eternal truths of human nature, but progressivism is like the postmodern spin on that idea. You think about postmodernism. Well, there's no one truth that's true for any of us. And so whereas liberalism could say, no, we're holding to universal human truths, progressives are pretty uncomfortable saying there's one truth that's right for everybody. And so what you get is, okay, well, but we still need to progress. So what do we do? So it's liberalism detached from an understanding of human nature that's anchored in something. So
Okay. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I'm sorry. I kind of process a lot on stuff like this. Progressivism assumes this metaphor of progress is a fact. Like we
right,
are going to progress and we are in charge of it. The question is, who's the we?
right,
And the second question is, what's the mechanism? And the we would always be people who are schooled in leftist Marxist theory. And the mechanism would always be control of the federal government or other governmental units, but
right,
preferably the federal government because it's the biggest. Is that
right.
about right?
Well, it's funny how that works, right? What are the main vehicles, yeah, for that change, and how do we help people progress whether they necessarily want to or not? And a lot of this comes from sort of critique of language. So that's when you see in academic institutions just words coming out willy nilly. Like you kind of get that academic leftist jargon. You get acronyms like LGBTQIA plus. It's bewildering to the average person, but it makes perfect sense if you're a progressive community organizer trying to create new categories of what it is to be human that define our humanity in order to achieve social change. So, to me, I think it's exactly what George Orwell was trying to warn us about, the redefinition of words. And so going back to today's conservative generation, they came of age. Their formative, most tender years were centered around 2020 and sort of you could say the apex of so many of these ideas, so many of these things came to a head. It's crazy to think, even just 5 years ago, but transgender ideology was well on the rise. England hadn't shut their Tavistock clinic, for example. Europe hadn't really started pumping the brakes. It was just all systems go on some of this. The world shut down. The government instituted these mandates that at the time, maybe you didn't know how that was going to go, but it turned out to a lot of people that it just was this invasive thing. And then come to find out in their minds, based on a lot of flimsy evidence, right? So you start distrusting all these institutions. You had race riots. American cities across our country were on fire. And, for those of us millennials who had even had a little more time under our belts, it was troubling, but maybe not formative in the way that I think for a lot of Gen Z, it was formative. And in particular, there's a sort of reactionary sense where we've had enough of these progressive ideas. We've had enough of what the elites are throwing at us. And so conservatism, just like liberalism morphed into progressivism, you could argue that conservatism has morphed into populism. And I know that some of these terms we're just defining and they're in flux, like they're in progress right now. But I don't know what you think about that idea. But to me, that the idea of populism is like a twist on classical conservative ideas. In that, listen, it's the elites. The elites are forcing this stuff down your throat, and it doesn't make any sense. They're redefining what men and women are. They are blaming white males predominantly as the cancer that's wrong with society. And whereas maybe you and I grew up in a world where things were more nuanced, I think for Gen Z, it just is like in their face, right in their most tender formative years. That's definitely the story with Nick Fuentes.
Okay. So I can easily picture a student on campus, if the student feels pushed around by progressive ideology, anyone who comes to their defense so that they don't get pushed around as much would be seen as an ally. The problem is that some of these allies are bringing to that defense an ideology that it isn't in any way coherent from a biblical worldview.
Right.
Is that a fair way to put it?
I do. I feel like that that sums it up. And in some ways, to me, like thinking about that populist twist brings together so many different threads that I've been trying to put my finger on recently. So some of these ideas, you could be definitely forgiven for. As my old colleague John Stone Street used to put it, this is an amazing time to be a conspiracy theorist. This is a conspiracy theorist Garden of Eden, because you look at everything with the Epstein files and all kinds of reasons we don't want to release those. And okay, now they're public. You look at, back in the day, people were like, did this COVID virus, maybe it was manufactured in China. And if you were saying that in 2020, people are like, you tin hat crazy alien believing. Like there's nothing true about that. Lo and behold, a couple of years later, it was manufactured in China. So some of these ideas you can understand, like, okay, our institutions, our leaders are just lying to us. But then you have all these other threads. So, Marjorie Taylor Greene in Congress, she believes some really strong things about life, about the role of government in society. But then she'll also post a tweet saying the government does control the weather. Try to double down on that kind of thing. Or even, and this is where we're really getting into today's water. So one of the things that the elites have had consensus on, roughly since World War II, is that fascism and socialism are both bad, and you can see that consensus starting to crumble. So for the progressives, they're like, well, if the change isn't really working like we need it, let's get more radical. So that's happening in New York right now, and the populists are starting to say, you know what, like maybe all these things that we've taken for granted, we have to throw out. So racial realism. That's a term coined, well, as far as I know, it's being used by Nick Fuentes right now. So essentially he's saying, okay, well, you're going to put all white people into a box. Well, we accept that box. And let's just talk about whites and blacks and Jews and talk about Mexicans. And he's using these racial terms like the progressive left has been using them for decades. And he's trying to say, listen, let's talk about race in a way that, elevates white people and dignifies their experience and kicks back against sort of being marginalized like that. So we're borrowing progressive ideas and we're implementing them in our populist sort of rejection of the elites.
Kasey, you were involved in debate in high school and in college, and I'm curious because there is a certain kind of strategy that is often used in policy debate, and essentially, we used it a lot when I was in college debate, where the team comes up and they say, this is our plan, this is what we're going to do, here are the reasons why. And then you will essentially say, okay, we grant you that everything you said is true, but it's not going to work if the United States federal government does it. It's only going to work if there is a world government. And so we propose a world government or something. It's all – nobody actually believes the stuff that you're saying. It's just sort of an intellectual jousting kind of thing.
Right.
Is that sort of – it's sort of like an intellectual judo in a way. Is that what Nick Fuentes is doing? Or is he genuinely that kind of a person who rejects the Constitution, supports more of a monarchical or a dictatorial system? How deep are his convictions, and how much of this is he just doing because he just loves making people mad?
Right. That is the question, Dr. Jeff. And there's no doubt, there's some fun in making people mad right now. And essentially that, I think, is the question that every news commentator is asking about Fuentes. Some are just convinced, no, he's a dyed-in-the-wool. Like, he has said things, for example, like Hitler was awesome. The Holocaust was a great idea. But when you watch the clip of him saying that, he's saying it with a smirk and just enough irony to maybe cast doubt on how legit he actually feels about that. In other moments, he said, no, we got to use irony to disguise some of the things that we're actually saying. So those are words out of his own mouth. So you can feel the alarm. Yeah. You can feel the alarm as people are like, well, you're not allowed to say that. But you can also feel, so there's an internet commentator, his channel, he's an apologist actually, it's called What Do You Meme? He's a guy named John McCrae. And he said, and this stuck out to me, when Fuentes uses these terms, rather than bigotry, what his followers hear is courage. Because he's essentially said, any restriction you're going to put on my language, you can't cancel me. I'm going to just embrace the crossing these social taboos. And to a generation that has felt policed in everything that they've said, what they're experiencing is courage. So in that sense, there's a strong element of irony to everything he says, but there's also a troubling tinge of seriousness as well. And the question maybe we should ask is maybe not what Nick Fuentes thinks or doesn't think, but what the most extreme members of the next generation are going to think and what they're going to latch onto. We tend to think we're just immune to bad ideas just because, whatever reason, we have the internet or we're raised in a Christian, nominally Christian culture. But we know from history that bad ideas, even ridiculous ideas, can absolutely take root if they're said enough.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's right. Yeah, and so I think what people should understand, if they're in my generation, Gen X or baby boomers, maybe even millennials, they don't quite grasp about Gen Z, is that Gen Z, especially influencers, tend to communicate in a deeply ironic fashion. Like that is an ironic view of the world is the way they approach things. And sometimes the irony is at 4 or 5 different levels, which if you're not paying attention to what's happening in the culture, you wouldn't grasp. There isn't such a thing that they see as taking words at face value. Words are things we play with to show that the world is absurd.
Right.
It is kind of a kind of caving into a postmodern perspective, but among young conservatives, it looks more like anarchy than anything else.
Right.
Tear it all down.
And the tricky thing is there's also just a deep hunger for stability. And that's where I think you see a lot of Gen Z influencers on the right now. They're reaching for, Rod Dreher put it well. He said, this generation has grown up without America's shared culture intact. They feel like they don't belong anywhere. It feels like the institutions and the culture is so thin. And on one level, that's reason for mockery and sort of a tear it all down. On the other hand, that could explain kind of a desperate striving for like, well, what is our culture? And people like Fuentes are going to be really black and white and say, well, it's white people. I mean, this he literally says is like, it's white people that creates America's culture, right? Which is a deeply flawed statement. I think that profoundly misunderstands what America is. We're not a nation based on race. We are uniquely a nation based on ideals, which is incredible. I think that's our unique genius as a country. And yeah, most of our founders were Englishmen. They would have seen themselves as Englishmen, holding to their God-given rights as Englishmen in the founding. So we gotta respect and not try to change that legacy, just see it accurately for what it was. But the beautiful thing about America is we're founded on ideals, but it is interesting. I think there's a reaching for community. I think there's a reaching for like, where do I belong? And there's a mocking of, progressive Gen Zers. They are sometimes so in earnest. There's like a starry-eyed, well, you just can't say that. And so I think the reaction within Gen Z, it's kind of a civil war within Gen Z where they're like, actually, we can say that, and there's nothing you can do to stop us from saying that. And then list a taboo, and they will, with glee, try to break it in sort of a revolt against that smothering progressive ideal.
Yeah. I can see, the sociology behind that would make a fascinating show as well. But I'm just wondering about the thing that it seems unites the left and the right in Gen Z at the present time is a rising anti-Semitism.
Right.
Now, this is the one culturally acceptable prejudice. And I'm not just talking about it in the United States, literally around the world.
Right.
If you're in Rwanda, the Hutu might hate the Tutsis, but everybody hates Jews. Right. And you look in the Middle Eastern countries, something like 95% in Egypt of Egyptians hate Jews. And you just go, you go around the world, you realize, man, there are 93 countries in the world. And in virtually all of them, anti-Semitism is the one socially acceptable prejudice.
Right.
So I think we need to talk about it because it is core to the way Nick Fuentes is making his arguments. And it is a rising issue among young conservatives as well as among young progressives.
Absolutely. One of the orthodoxies that the next generation is challenging is sort of a neoconservative idea of how we do politics. So the United States should project strength through international policy. We should fight for democracies overseas. We shouldn't be afraid to get involved. You can picture sort of the George W. Bush and H.W. Bush model of international engagement. Today's conservatives and this sort of civil war, quote unquote, civil war within MAGA republicanism right now has everything to do with that question and specifically to do with are we going to support Israel or not? Are we America first? This is how it would be phrased. Are we America first or are we Israel first? And I say that, Dr. Jeff, to say that it's not enough to just label things under a certain, like, you can't say that umbrella and leave it at that. I think the fatal mistake the left has made is to not take ideas seriously. Because you think about, under progressive ideology, it's all about group identity politics. So it's like, I don't need to take your ideas seriously if you're a white man. Now, it's a caricature, but it's kind of true of how progressive thought, it's got a big blind spot. They don't take religious beliefs seriously. They don't take ideas as seriously as they should. And so I think the mistake we would make with Gen Z is to say, well, listen, you can't ask that question. You're just not allowed. Instead, what I think we need to do is, as daunting as this is, we need to sift through the sort of gumball of ideas that are being advocated for by those like Fuentes. So you have a huge variety of things that he's trying to say. And they range from, in my mind, as I've been thinking about this, I've categorized them as fair, false, and then foul. Right? So you could think about, okay, are there fair things that it's like, I don't agree with, but we could debate? You could put one of those as, from an international foreign policy standpoint, should the United States support the nation state of Israel? Now, I think the answer to that is pretty clear. I actually think we better, because they are the one democracy in the Middle East. But you could be a good faith Christian and say, listen, I don't hate Jews, I love Jews, but what's our foreign policy going to be? And we can debate that. Then he's got all kinds of, I would say, false ideas. So he will say things like the Jews are controlling everything in the United States. I mean, that's false, but it's slippery like a good conspiracy theory because it's hard to disprove. Because then people will just start naming all the Jews that are in high level positions of power. And boy, that's persuasive. If you don't know anything else about this topic, but you just hear a rant where he lists all these powerful Jewish people, and you don't have a counter argument to that, it's very tricky. And I think an argument like that is false because it's not made in good faith. And then there's the foul. There's things that it's just, listen, man, you shouldn't say the N-word. There's mannerisms and things that I don't think any civilized country should tolerate because they're indecent. They actually go against God's design for goodness. And ironically, Fuentes, in reaching for he would call himself a Christian nationalist as well. And he would say he's a Christian. In trying to recover that, he's devastating the heart of a Christian ethos, which is love your enemy. So anyway, I don't know if that's how you've been thinking about it, but for me, I pictured it as the fair, the false, and then the foul. There are some things we just shouldn't tolerate. There's some things we should engage on. And then there's the kind of false ideas right in the middle that are built on bad assumptions. Yeah.
Kasey, I'm wondering, and I don't mean to back away from this topic. I actually want to move toward it, but just a little higher level question. When I was in college, this started. It seemed like people were trying to deal with their unsettledness about society, their desire to find stability, by simplifying everything in the world into an oppressor versus oppressed mindset. That we need to prove to the world that we are victims, not that we're helpless, because we can lash out, and we're justified in lashing out if we're victims. Because it would be the right thing to do. But it plays into this oppressor versus oppressed mindset. It seems like that's the default mode of a lot of Gen Zers. So if you're on the left, you hate Jewish people because of colonialism. If you're on the right, you hate Jewish people because of conspiracy.
Right.
But you do hate Jewish people, and you hate them because you are a victim of them. Is that maybe that's just too idealistic of a way of framing it, but
wow. I think
I'm just seeing the oppressor versus oppressed thing everywhere in this conversation.
Isn't it so interesting that when you look at 20th century history, the extremes of fascism and communism head in opposite directions, then they go around the back of the block and they meet up in the back alley. Right?
No kidding.
You have two regimes doing the exact same thing, murdering dissidents, stifling dissent in the name of their cause and in the name of fighting each other. And isn't that
abolishing private property, as the core to both. Right. Yeah.
Isn't that just human nature? We love to go in our separate directions and then meet in the middle in the worst of our tendencies. I think that nails it. I think postmodern progressivism and Postmodern populism have the exact same fatal flaws. They're both prone to falsehood. Progressives are fine warping language if it suits the change that they want to see happen in the world. Populists are pretty okay believing things on just a thread of evidence. Where's our quality control? But if it fits in the narrative of the elites are oppressing you, it feels good. And being a progressive in some ways feels good. It feels a little complicated if you're of the oppressor class and you have to do all these gymnastics to try to make it right. It's like a very stringent religion. But if you're a populist, it feels good to not take responsibility for our country's problems and to always have a bogeyman to blame. And I'm not saying...
Kasey,
go ahead. Yeah.
This is awesome. This is so good. This is bringing a lot of clarity for me in the way I'm thinking of things. When you were with students and you realize they're kind of processing everything that they hear from this victim mindset, I'm the oppressed, and so I'm justified at lashing out at the oppressor. How do you help them back away from that way of thinking?
Oh, man. That's such a great question, Dr. Jeff. And I love our legacy as Summit Ministries on this question because we've never been shy about what we believe. We have a book out. You have a book out called Should Christians Support Israel? It's not going to be a question when you come to Summit what we think about the United States and our foreign policy towards Israel. However, our posture is always one of listening. Proverbs 20:5 says, "The purposes of a man's heart are deep waters, but one with wisdom, one with insight, draws them out." And that should be our goal as Christians. And to be honest, it's what we should have been. It's what so many Christians have been doing with hard left progressives. I don't agree with anything you're saying, but unpack, how did you get there? What's your life story? Have you experienced racism in your, tell me more of your story so I can get to the heart of why you believe what it is you believe. And listen, we'll disagree, but I'll still love you because Jesus still loves you. When you can introduce that in the water, it's beautiful. And so we've been geared toward doing this towards progressives that we disagree with. How well are we doing towards conservatives that we disagree with? Conservatives who, and again, there's alarming things that Fuentes and others say, but when a Gen Zer comes through our doors, or we encounter them in the world, if it's your son or your daughter or someone I think we got to reach for our utility belt, which is asking questions from a place of genuine love. Be merciless with ideas and merciful towards people. And I think what we can do if we do that is help Gen Z sort out legitimate questions, the fair questions, from the false questions, the false ideas, from the foul. That just goes against a Christian worldview. We just can't accept that. Even if we love you, we won't stand for the behavior of lumping everyone into a racial category and diminishing their humanity. We wouldn't stand for that with progressives. We're just not going to stand for it with populists. We're going to need to be more careful than that. But yeah, and in my experience, Gen Z are just sick of being shut down on this question. There are questions that, to be honest, I actually think I get excited because we have great answers. When you really want to ask, should we be supporting Israel? Shouldn't we be supporting Jordan or, any of these other Middle Eastern states? I think when you take that question seriously, the answer makes itself pretty clear pretty quickly.
Yes.
I don't know what you would say about that, Dr. Jeff. You're literally the author of the book.
Well, I wrote that book after coming back from the war, and I spent a lot of time talking to Israelis, but also Palestinians, Jews, but also Christians and also Muslims, and Messianic Jews who don't fit in anybody's camp. And then I spent a lot of time with, just believers, non-believers, just different people in different places in life, and came back and realized, I think we have sort of allowed our leaders to position this as a geopolitical conflict when I think it's actually a theopolitical one at root. And so, man, and this is probably going to have to be a whole other show. Well, we'll just see what the response is to this show and see if others want to talk about this a little bit more. But a lot of people, when they're Christians and they're of a conservative persuasion, now moving more populist, as you've explained, they back their way into a theology that they think gives a warrant to what they've already decided to believe. And a lot of times that theology comes from them uncoupling the New Testament from the Old Testament. You know, Jesus was Jewish, yes, of course, but only incidentally, because he happened to grow up in that part of the world. It's not central to who Jesus is. The church, you know, Jews are no longer relevant to God's plan. The church is it. That's all there is from this point forward. You know, God divorced his covenant relationship with Israel. Things like that. People say that, and they kind of make premillennial dispensationalism the enemy,
Right.
because it supports more robustly the modern state of Israel. And
Right.
Kasey, I just find this, I don't know what to do with it. I'm disturbed by it. In the book, I tried to figure out what are the points of agreement, even if we have different perspectives on the end times. But man, when you see a battle against a genuinely false worldview of this radicalized kind of Islam represented by Hamas, Hezbollah, which are coming from two totally different perspectives inside of Islam, but they've banded together against the state of Israel because they ultimately want to destroy America. If we don't grasp that, we got three divisions of troops coming into the battle. We got premillennials coming into the battle, amillennialists coming into the battle, postmillennialists coming into the battle, and you got three divisions of troops. And all of a sudden, your three divisions start turning on each other. You never make it to the battle of ideas that really needs to be fought. I don't know if I'm correct on this, but this is just where my thinking goes.
I think that's so well said. And, you know, within Christianity, I'm going to tip my hand here. I don't think it matters whether you're a dispensationalist or whether you're reformed when it comes to, because we've actually not been talking about, are the Jewish people saved apart from the cross? If we're talking about that, then then that's a theological discussion. We're actually talking geopolitics. And I think when it comes to that, and you've articulated this well with the three levels of there's principles, there's policies, and there's people. Mm-hmm. And the principles Scripture gives us are do right, fight for justice, you know, those sort of things. It actually doesn't give us like a policy roadmap. And so I tend to find when the conversation gets to, well, you're just a dispensationalist, aren't you? There are Christian dispensationalists who support Israel. However, I would argue the dispensationalism itself is a straw man. It's not actually the reason any of us should support Israel. And you and I have talked about this too. We're trying to steer the discussion away from that because it's a bit of a red herring. It actually doesn't really matter if you're a dispensationalist or if you're reformed. Are you going to, is your foreign policy, should our foreign policy as a nation be centered around justice? Then I actually think you nailed it with Islam. I find that the progressive left and this new populist right, I think they both badly misunderstand the worldview of Islam. You know, to the left, it's like they're the oppressed people group, and that's all there is to that. And you got that one lens on, and so you can't even see the history of the nation state of Israel from the 40s when the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem's consorting with Hitler, like, hey, how do we liquidate these people when you guys take over Jerusalem? It's like that doesn't fit in your oppressive, worldview. And on the populist right, you see, well, everyone basically wants to just hold to their own homeland, and we should, Americans need a homeland for us, and let's just let the Muslims kind of manage their affairs overseas. And, I just want to scream sometimes, like, dude, we got to remember our own history, how in the 30s we would turn back boats full of hundreds of people fleeing from the Holocaust and just send them back to Europe, to deal with their own problems. And so is there nuance, is there balance in all of this? Yes, but I don't think the theology is the main thing. I think it's questions of how do we produce a just foreign policy as America and as Israel, which happens to be the only country in the Middle East that supports individual liberty, voting, free speech, and religious tolerance of a healthy kind. They're it. There's no other horse to back in the Middle East. So
yeah, that's right. Well, often the criticisms I hear of dispensationalism, like as you mentioned, they turn it into a straw man. They aren't arguing against dispensationalism; they're arguing against a caricature of dispensationalism. But it is something we probably need to do a whole show on explaining what these differences are and where they come from historically and all of that. If you're watching or listening and you're interested in that, reach out and let us know, because we won't do the show if people don't really care. But if we recognize what's really going on. I mean, if you think about Islam, there are 53 Muslim nations that are members of the Organization of Islamic States. There's one Jewish state. There are 120 Muslims in the world for every one Jew in the world. And if you ask people, and I've done this many times, and you've been there too, you've talked to Palestinians in the West Bank. So I know, because you and I have talked about this. If you ask them, what do you think should happen? They say Israel should cease to exist. And then if you ask them why, because they're the little Satan. That's the answer they give every time. They're the little Satan. Okay, so who's the big Satan? And they always tell you the same thing. It's the United States.
Right. No ambiguity to that answer, usually.
There's never any ambiguity to it. And I know people find this hard to believe. If you haven't actually been there and walked the streets in West Bank communities and talked to people, you wouldn't see it. Okay, man, this has been really clarifying and helpful. I guess we got to wrap up here, but I kind of want to know, is this a fad that's going to go away with time? I mean, is Nick Fuentes just sort of the guy of the moment who he says crazy things, and so it's sort of like a fire truck going by. We all look out the window, but then we don't really care if there's a fire at the end of it.
Right. That's such a good point, Dr. Jeff. And it is true that there can be some melodrama in politics right now. I don't know if I'm off base for saying that, but sometimes something about politics can get a little melodramatic in our day and age. It's the infotainment, algorithmic, just sort of corruption of the news cycle that we're all fighting against. So, you never want to subscribe to melodrama. And however, we talk about, there's always a question behind the question, isn't there? Like I said, I don't think the question is why someone like Nick Fuentes would exist and ask these questions. You just look just before World War II in our history, and everyone was asking these same questions, and people had a much more racist and bad framework for how to handle these questions. It's actually human nature to veer into tribalism and even anti-Semitism. So it's not surprising that the questions are being answered. The question is what's behind the question. And right now, I think within the conservative movement, several massive ideological points are being discussed right now. I mean, one would be just the idea of, are there some people or ideas that are so wrong that we shouldn't engage with them? People were furious with Tucker Carlson for giving this softball interview to Fuentes, right? I mean, that's a live question. Like, who gets a chance to speak into this? Is there anyone who should actually be off the reservation? I actually think if you're a postmodern populist and you're influenced by your culture's seeping postmodernism, you tend to be like, hey, don't cancel anyone, right? Because there's no moral framework for which ideas. I actually think a biblical worldview tells us that there are some ways of speaking that are so dehumanizing that we just shouldn't give them the time of day. But we should always take the ideas seriously. We should advance and critique and think carefully about ideas, not hide from them. But people's mannerisms in public is actually a part of the shared morality that we've lost. And conservatives and liberals are both kind of just stewing in the mud with that right now. That's my opinion on that. But there's all kinds of questions.
All kinds of questions. When Jesus was talking in the Sermon on the Mount in the book of Matthew, he said, be on your guard against false prophets or false teachers who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravaging wolves. You will recognize them by their fruit. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? In the same way, every good tree produces good fruit, but a bad tree produces bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, neither can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So you will recognize them by their fruit. And then he goes on from there to say, therefore, whoever hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came, the rivers rose, the winds blew and pounded that house, yet it didn't collapse because its foundation was built on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came, the rivers rose, the winds blew and pounded that house, and it collapsed. It collapsed with a great crash. We need to be going back and studying that passage and asking God, would you show me what good fruit looks like? Would you enable me to be a person who produces good fruit? And would you enable me to recognize the wolves in sheep's clothing so that I may avoid being influenced by them? They'll always exist. There are always going to be false prophets out there, but that doesn't mean you have to take them seriously or let them influence your life. And it doesn't mean that you have to somehow think that their ideas are credible because, after all, that's what free speech is about. That isn't it. Am I going to try to shut them up from saying the things they say? Nope. But if I have the opportunity to avoid them, to ignore them, to let their vile statements just go the way of all vile statements, the way all vile statements should ultimately go into the dustbin of history. And I can persuade other people in my life to just say, look, that was a moment. It was crazy. What's your fruit? What's your fruit? That's the thing we should be asking and talking about.
Absolutely. And I think one of the questions behind the question right now, Dr. Jeff, is, can democracy hold together without a shared culture? I think they're asking that in Europe. I think we're starting to ask that in America. Can our republic, our constitutional republic, can we hold together without a shared culture? And a close, Ben Franklin said, half a truth is often a great lie. And I think the lie that gets close to it is, we just got to recover that good old white culture. It's like we're looking for okay, what's the shared culture? I think that's the question that the next generation's asking. I think Scripture gives us such a better answer. I think America can absolutely hold together with multiculturalism, but we can't hold together without a shared adherence to the ideas that made democracy possible on this continent, a Judeo-Christian framework. It's the ideas. It's not the ethnicity. It's the ideas. And, Christians, the preponderance of what a Christian looks like has changed so many times throughout history, but the truth of the gospel is unchanging. And so the best antidote to these bad ideas is exactly what you said. What's the fruit? Can we recover the kind of robust, open to dialogue, not dehumanizing, but actually moving past the crassness and into really seeking out someone's well-being? Can we gather together in community when everything in our technological culture is just pulling us apart? Can we create new culture based on the gospel, not on some return to an idyllic, one culture nation, but based on the shared truth of Christ at the center of all reality? That's our only hope. It's no small feat, right? We will need a major revival to see that happen. It's not easy. We will need evangelism. We will need people to come into the kingdom who aren't there yet. But aside from that, I actually think the answer is no. Democracy can't hold together. But we need something deeper than just populism. It's not just the elites who have brought this upon us. It's our own rejection of the life-giving truth that Jesus is the center of all reality.
That's so good. And, and beyond the performance and the noise of what's getting paid attention to in social media right now, on college campus after college campus at the present time, students who are admired by other students, often athletes, are standing up, proclaiming their faith. Students are coming to Christ. They're getting baptized. Frank Turek goes on to campus to answer their apologetics questions, and 2,000 people show up. Lisa Childers, all of these other Summit Ministries instructors who are out there doing this right now. But that's not in the news. So we kind of think maybe it isn't happening, but it is happening. That's the reality beyond the crazy stuff that often gets the focus of the camera lens.
Yeah. So well said. Yeah.
Well, this has been a great show. Thank you so much, Kasey, for doing this. So this is the Truth Changes Everything podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jeff Myers. Kasey Leander, who's the director of the summer program here in Colorado at Summit Ministries. Kasey, you're doing an amazing job with weaving together truth and relationship for these students. And if you want more of the kind of thing and the sort of discussion that we've just had, and you're 16 to 22, we want to see you this coming summer. We want you to go to summit.org, sign up for a Summit Ministry, a slot in one of the Summit Ministries programs. They're already filling up. And we're recording this just before Thanksgiving 2025. They're already filling up, so don't wait to do that. Talk to the people in your life. If you've got children in that age range, we would love to have them come to one of those programs. What we're going to do is equip them and support them to embrace God's truth and to champion a biblical worldview. So just go to summit.org. You can get more information on those programs. But man, thanks again, Kasey, for taking time to be on the show today.
Dr. Jeff, an honor to be here.